Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to be able to share some of the research that I've been doing over the last bunch of years around food and egg systems development, and it's fun to be back. I got my PhD at the University of Minnesota here some years ago and studied ecology on this side of the river, as it were, at times, and so it's a lot of fun to be back here sharing work that I've been doing. So I want to present on specifically the Sustainable Agriculture Project from a couple of different perspectives, and I look forward to all kinds of questions and comments and criticisms and whatever else comes up. So I've got a series of sort of chapters that I want to go through quickly here. And first one is just the introduction.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on STAG and skip out from here during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
So that was Gil Scott-Heron, as you know, and that was a famous song, an important song in the late 60s for the revolution that was happening and perceived to be happening at that time. And in an interview later, Heron talked about that song was about your mind. You have to change your mind before you change the way you live and the way you move. The thing that's going to change people will be something that no one will ever be able to capture on film. It will just be something you see and all of a sudden you realize, I'm on the wrong page. And of course, today, I don't have to rehearse for this audience, or hopefully any audience, the ecological revolution that is taking place all around us in communities, regions, and the world more generally, in which human activities are powerfully stressing natural systems to the point of flipping them into other modes that may or may not support the life forms that evolved in those. And that revolution, for better or worse, is being televised, and you can go watch it at any point as the story of the week. But this is more than an episodic story, right? It's a serious story that is the biggest challenge, I suspect, that we humans have ever faced. How do we harmonize our human systems with natural systems in ways that allow us to endure over the long period? It's a question we've really never asked before, and it's certainly something we've never really faced in terms of what we think of as civilization, that form of human organization that evolved in different places over the last 10,000 years that we call agrarian society, civilizations, or however you want to frame that, right? And the idea is that we have to get to a place where we can harmonize our social, our economic, and our ecological systems and sort of find that sweet spot where all of them function happily, but don't overwhelm each other, right? And that's the kind of game. This is the framework that that is widely used. This here is the right page, as it were, in Gil Scott-Heron's framework, right? So what I want to do is think about this. How do we respond and turn to the right pages at universities? How do we make colleges and universities manufacturers of this sustainable revolution? And I want to show you how one small piece of that is being iterated forward in this project called the Sustainable Agriculture Project at the University of Minnesota. So just briefly, and I'll return to this, SAP is a 10-acre organic transition farm and a 5-acre apple orchard on the former Northeast Experimental Station. And I'll tell you a little bit about the history of that in a few minutes. It's a working farm. This year we'll probably produce about 30,000 pounds of produce within an organic rotation system, and 90% of that produce will flow into the dining services. And it's a partnership the SAP with a host of community-based organizations, and this partnership with the Dining Services as a social enterprise in which they purchase the produce and supply resources. And I'll talk more specifically about that in a minute. And there's a series of faculty who are engaged in organizing this that we call a faculty collaborative. Myself, Cindy Hale, Pat Farrell, David Searing, Stacy Stark, and Rachel McCarroll. We founded this in '09, and it's housed in the College of Liberal Arts. So, again, briefly, this is part of the map of a Google map of the Sustainable Agriculture Project. This all used to be part of the Northeast Experimental Station, and so we have this orchard here and a 10-acre site here and possibly more land over here as we expand our capacity to manage it. So the second sort of chapter I want to talk about is why a farm? Why do a farm at a university, right? And my background over the last 15 years is in systems thinking, trying to understand a process of how things, which regarded as systems, influence one another within a whole. And here we're concerned with how to boundary a system, whether a human or natural or a social ecological system that brings those two together. And think about the dynamics of flow in that system, both inside of it and outside, how it's nested in other human and natural systems in our N of one social ecological system, the Earth. Think about questions of scale, how we work with that, and how these systems have changed over the time, which is, of course, really key because we're in this moment of violent change. And then, as Gil Scott-Heron said, it's about how you think, but it's also how you move, right? How do you operationalize and use these ideas? And for me, this principle of subsidiarity is really important. Details matter. Working on sustainability at the most local levels is probably the only way we're going to add up to a more sustainable planet. You look at all the attempts at the global level for climate change negotiations, and while some of them are iterating forward slowly, for the most part, they haven't been very successful. On the contrary, cities, communities, and so forth are making big steps in iterating this forward because at the most local levels, you have personal relationships, you understand institutions, and you can create consensus over time in terms of doing the things necessary to harmonize these systems. And also then, for me, action research projects. I'm really interested in theory and method, but I also want to work in the field. I want to put these ideas in motion because, you know, I'm one of those people who believe that we have a couple of decades to really help evolve different kinds of systems before we experience very, very serious ecological change of types we probably won't like. And so these system patterns, critical materials of goods and services. And as you know, our human systems are organized around four really critical areas: food, water, energy, transportation, and we could throw in buildings there as well. But you know, if the 20th century played out the pattern of highly centralized critical systems, I'm convinced that the 21st century is going to explore and iterate patterns of distributed systems, systems that you know, can absorb the problems that our human systems create, that natural systems can absorb them, that we don't create the monstrous problems of Fukushima Daiichi or climate change at that scale, but rather we take, again, responsibility and utilize our local natural systems to absorb some of the perturbations we're making in them. But of course, not without a struggle. We live in an institutionally enveloped world. And of course, our institutions have evolved over the 20th century to perpetuate what they have put together, right? institutions are all about equilibrium, trying to figure out how they balance and perpetuate forward their position within the larger system. And so, for example, struggling with, say, oil companies over what kinds of energy systems we're going to move forward is a formidable task. Electric companies all over the country are resisting distributed solar systems now, throwing monkey wrenches in the available technologies that can do this. Because why? Because they lose their market share in a controlled fashion by these distributed systems. And so, you know, it's not just enough to know about the technologies and how to get them going, but it's also how to wrestle with institutions designed for equilibrium that try stop these new modes. Climate isn't stopping. Natural systems changes is rapidly changing and probably ramping up. And so we have this huge disconnect between relatively stable institutions that are trying to hold on to their market shares and to their social shares and so forth and so on, and natural systems that are, in a sense, moving into rapid change, right? And just a footnote, of course, that, you know, it's not all about, okay, let's shift from central to distributed systems. I mean, you know, we're going to need centralized systems probably forever. We want them. They're useful. And certainly in things like transportation, we want to actually move from the highly individualized distributed system of the automobile into more mass transit centralized systems. But the general pattern that I'm talking about still, you know, holds true. I work in food systems against the backdrop of these ideas. And of course, as you know, most of our food system procurement comes from this global and national sourcing. The result of a century of development for centralized systems that has concentrated the power and the flow of our process of transmitting nature into culture around foodstuffs that also allow large-scale corporations and food systems to consolidate their power and influence on how we think, how we taste, and other ways, right? And again, this is not, you know, an issue about, okay, we got to get rid of all these, we got to institute these. What we have to do is figure out where the sweet spot is in these options and increase the percentage of production in these distributed areas, and figure out then how the centralized systems, the industrialized systems, can be altered and harmonized with natural systems as well. There's a variety of models, ways to think about this, but you know, this is our current model, where basically most of, in the United States, the foodstuffs that we consume in terms of vegetables and so forth is grown in California, the Central Valley, in the wake of the gigantic you know, hydrological transformation of the Interdesert West beginning in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that provided a subsidized agriculture in the Central Valley to flourish and, again, consolidate its market share, and then basically help dismantle local food systems all around the country. In other words, these distributed systems that existed all around the country over the course of the since 1950s has been largely dismantled. And there's a lot of attempts to try, you know, iterate new models around these integrated regional food sheds where, you know, regions can, you know, take responsibility for production, processing, and distribution, but also work with each other to maybe, you know, this area grows apples well and, you know, Wisconsin grows cheese well, or whatever it is, right? Where then you can leverage your ecosystem in sustainable ways to produce surplus, then that, et cetera, right? And so this model is being iterated all around the country, and you guys have seen that transformation, even, you know, in Minneapolis or Duluth or anywhere around the country really in the last few years. And this is starting to ramp up because larger institutions, most notably health agencies, health departments, hospitals, and the health sector more generally, and governments that are looking at the financial costs of highly processed food that's at the heart of the centralized model is making people increasingly sick with obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and that cost is spiking up, threatening to essentially bankrupt us as a nation. And so CDC and other entities are trying to figure out how they can enter this transformative process and incentivize the transition to distributed systems in food. For me, this is both a kind of professional and personal interest because this is a distributed model of food systems that I grew up on in western Minnesota. And it's like millions of others that populated the country, small-scale farms, 80 to 150 acres, that created the food systems, you know, that existed from really the turn of the 1900s to when urbanization had taken shape, and we had to invent new systems in order to deliver food to these concentrated spaces. And this was really a successful model for about 50 years until World War II, when everything began to rapidly change, right? This is a centralized pattern of that system now. Again, in the area I grew up, this is the farm that I grew up on. And when I grew up, this was all wetlands. This was a wetland. This was a wetland. There were farms here. There were 2 farms here. There was a farm here. There was a farm here. There were farms everywhere. And this is in very rich land in Lackaparra County. And across the late 50s and early 60s, the sort of hydrological reconstruction of that landscape was taking place through tiling, and the petrochemicalization of the systems began to take shape, and pretty soon resulted in this kind of system where you have very few people living in rural spaces, creating food production at giant scales of, say, 3,000 to 5,000 acre corporate scale farms, right? And right across the road from where I grew up is this, which is called, right, a CAFO, a controlled animal feedlot operation. But really it's a bunch of shit. Because what they do is concentrate thousands of animals in these boxes, don't let them move around, in this case pigs, and then the resource that those animals create becomes poison in these so-called lagoons. And then those lagoons poison the water table. So all around this landscape now, you can't drink the water. Everybody has to bring their water in. Everybody dies of cancer. Almost everybody. It's amazing. And it's the gift of the industrial food system that keeps on giving. And so, you know, this is an example of a centralized agricultural system that has turned resources into poison and created these large-scale problems that add up to climate change and other issues. And you could go through and do this little thing in water systems, energy systems, etc., right? Because they follow roughly similar patterns. And so what we're trying to do at the University of Minnesota Duluth is create a small-scale distributed farming system that can model this transition forward into the future, not backwards. I hate nostalgia. Nostalgia is only useful for evoking people to action because it clouds people's analysis, but at any rate, it's part of our human life. But, and so this is a 10-acre farm that really is a learning laboratory for social ecological relations for students at UMD. And I'll come back to more about that in a minute. So, how a university farm? So SAP has evolved because in sort of surprising ways, you might say, because there was no plan at the beginning of what exactly should be done. It was really kind of like adhering to Shakespeare's idea of how do you know where to go? Well, through indirection, find the direction, right? You have to sort of get lost in order to find what direction really you should go to get to the right page a lot of times in research. And so this came out of when I first moved to Duluth in 2008, the first thing that I did, because I've been institutionalized in university systems for a while at Rice University, ASU, and I was lucky enough to move back home to help aging family and so forth. And so one of the first things I did was snowball interview 50, 60, 80 people in the community, what was going on in food and environmental issues. And out of that came this Superior Grown Food Summit that brought together a couple hundred people, 225 people, to talk about our food system and express a community vision for how this was going to happen. And one of the leitmotifs in those interviews and in this was, God, the university has this farm, and it's been abandoned for 40 years. Why? We need this, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, this dovetailed on some research that was going on with some colleagues, notably David Abaz, who's an amazing farmer up there, who did a food shed study trying to map out in physical terms whether or not our bioregion had the capacity to produce all the food that we could eat if we wanted to. Not that we had to, but if we wanted to, right? And so the idea is, can we create in people's minds the idea that we can do this, change people's mind? And his essay, his study is really fascinating in that direction. And then we went about taking an asset building approach to growing SAP, thinking about assets that we had in this era of diminished resources at universities. So we have students. Students are famously impatient. You know, I lived in Norway, and there's this great word called ungdomsmot, which is the opposition of youth, right? Because they are impatient, particularly at universities where they have 4 years to sort of cut their teeth, and they arrive as freshmen, not knowing what they're up to often, moving into sophomore, and then by junior year, they're going to change everything, and then by seniors, they're gone. So you've got that like 1, 2, 3 year window to work with them to harness that ungdomsmot that is really important because they are inheriting the earth, of course. We had faculty and staff. We had this heritage knowledge of the farm, a college farm movement. We had the heritage farm knowledge of area organic farmers, helping organizations, and land. We had the abandoned farm up there. And as I said, this all used to be a 240-acre experimental station that opened in 1912. And from 1912, when, in a sense, Duluth was dropped from a spaceship onto the rocky shores of Lake Superior so that 100,000 people could work together to extract timber and iron ore without farming and agricultural systems, this was a very powerful piece of architecture. And it was really key to growing a food system. And by 1920, Duluth was in about 15 years, because there was a big broad-based citizen business government movement in addition to the university. By 1920, Duluth area was shipping food all over the Midwest. And it's an amazing story that I've been doing research on, you know, because again, there's uses to history, and patterns of the past are really fun as well. So this was the abandoned farm as it was. And again, having been institutionalized for a decade and a half, I knew how to work the system an important skill at universities. How do you go about gaining access, gaining stewardship over some land in order to start something that people don't really understand why you would want to do that? And, you know, just some eye candy from some of the reports of the experimental station, the first institute in 1914, the farm in the 30s. It was a campus, 3 families lived there. The institute, it was, you know, all kinds of things happening on that to help people figure out how to grow a food system in the Lake Superior bioregion. And this is probably the height of the farm in the 1950s because World War II was, you know, like all wars, a powerfully transformative event in the United States in the sense that, you know, normal rules are suspended and culture change, social change happens really fast. And there were lots of changes, nuclear power, radar, detergents, pesticides, you name it, there was tons of them. But one of the things is our food system dramatically changed, in part because of the research done by the Army to respond to emaciated potential soldiers growing up in the Depression who now were supposed to go fight in the war, and how do you get them up to speed? And so they invented something called MREs, Meals Ready to Eat, which was the forerunner to our fast food system, to our TV dinners, and all of that. And that set in motion a powerful process of change in our food system as corporations and business more generally once again regained its standing that it had lost in 1929 because of what it had done. I don't know why that didn't happen in 2007, but that's another story. And after the war, because of the importance of these large systems to fight the war, they were once again ascendant, and we have the organizational man, the corporate system, and the expanding world that we have inherited. And this is what it was like. Abandoned, no trespassing signs. And so we went about gaining access to this, working with students to create this 10-acre organic farm as a process of manufacturing our most important products, students. Universities are powerful levers of change in society because we work with a big wheel. They're little wheels when they come in here, but when they leave, they go all over the world, and they bring the ideas that they hear, read about, and live. It's important, you know, to other places. And right now, of course, students are bringing lots of rhetoric, but they're seeing campuses that are struggling to actually live the sustainable revolution, to walk the talk. And that's a real powerful challenge that we all face. How do we, you know, alter this giant system of change that is a university so it can be an engine of transformative change in our broader society? So what we've done is try to, in a couple of levels. One is to create this community food system public space that has invited, we market to, 90% of it goes to dining services, but we also do some grocers and direct market so that the students get experience with entrepreneurship, how to work with different clients, et cetera, et cetera. We work with the public school system and the Duluth Community Garden Program in helping teachers learn how to utilize school gardens as training, you know, spaces. Duluth, all of Duluth schools are getting school gardens now as part of a CDC-funded process. And the Community Garden Program, our idea is not to replace community organizations, but to strengthen them. So the community garden in our context, the community garden program in Duluth, has been really powerful, sort of growing up between the cracks of the industrial food system beginning in the 1980s. And so we see our role as trying to empower that program as it helps the school system iterate forward, both at the level of teaching and its change of the food system itself. We work with the Intertribal Agriculture Council, which is a federally funded organization designed to help tribes change for better their food and agricultural systems. And so we grow 3 kinds this year of tribal corn: Meskwaki, Oneida, and Manitoba White. And the interest of the Intertribal Council is to grow something in that public space, to have a reason to invite tribal leaders to see what a learning farm could look like for tribal colleges. We work with the Northeast Beekeepers Association, who run our apiary, and we get the ecological services of the bees. We work with the national organization Xerxes Society, which is a native pollinator organization, and the Lakewood Berry Farm. So, SAP as a community food systems incubator, right? The other piece of SAP is a lever for institutional food systems change. And this is a picture of the first deliveries to the dining services, which has been a slow dance to work with them to, to readjust their personnel, organizational tools, etc., systems all so that they can shift from serving highly processed food to minimally processed food. And that's a very complicated thing at institutions, not because people don't want to, but because the system is built for equilibrium. Oftentimes, universities are zero-sum game institutions. If I get something, somebody else is going to think they're not going to get it. Or, I have my vested interest in this kind of system, and everything else is a threat. And so iterating this forward is very complicated, of course, as everybody knows here, given our common institutionalization, right? So what we did first is we were lucky to get a grant from the Institute for Advanced Study for a faculty seminar. And we changed that to create to sort of break down the silos between faculty and operations, academics and operations, and community. And about 25 people, including the procurer for dining services, the person from facilities management, etc., as well as key community people and some faculty who were interested, to go through a semester where we thought about, okay, what is the good food revolution? What is its character in the Western Lake Superior region? How can UMD help it emerge? And how does that system, or should that system, affect UMD? And so it was a fun process that really resulted in the beginning of this change. But as I say, it's complex. Institutions by nature are geared toward equilibrium, and we need fairly rapid change. Institutions like universities were created according to logical development, but they function at times in highly illogical ways, right? Contradictions between administration, academics, operations, and then internal to those entities. So it's important to understand both formally and informally how that system works if you're going to try to do something with it. But universities, again, are powerful change agents, and if not for us, who? And it's not our responsibility, but we have an obligation, I believe, to help this help our space, both its teaching and its physical plant, to become laboratories for learning and teaching and modeling institutional change. And so our partnership with Dining Services is iterating forward. It's relationship dependent, both informal and formal. And all sustainability is local, to paraphrase Tip O'Neill. You really got to know not just theory, but you got to know the people. You got to know how the system evolved over time. where the power exists formally and informally, who to engage, et cetera, et cetera. So, but UMD has a unique dining service. It's the only one in the entire university system that's self-operated. You know, we're kind of backwater in Duluth, and that can be good. You know, we were not caught up in the great centralization of dining systems that the rest of the university experienced. But this is a tenuous place because the classical economists who populate business offices want stable information, stable data. How much? How much does this cost every year? How much am I making every year? Et cetera, you know. And a self-operated system can have ups and downs, whereas a corporate system can simply absorb that, and you know, and the output, the relationship to the university, can be stable with all kinds of issues with that, right? And I won't get into that. Dining services, like all parts of universities, of course, function as a bureaucracy and operate as a business in this situation. And so, you know, but it's also self-aware of its need to adapt to the present and evolving food culture, right? It can't simply be the corporate pattern of industrial food, or why would we keep it, right? So we have a chance to make this really unique and so forth. And they are, you know, brilliant in their forward thinking on this. So SAP in this context then becomes a lever for systems change, because as a subunit, we can experiment differently than the dining services can, right? And we can change, we can affect internal change in a way that the dining services can't on its own, because it's caught up in the equilibrium of an institutional bureaucracy. And as the relationship is developed, UMD sees more value in our relationship and is allocating more resources. Presently, they hire 150 hours of students a week to work on the farm, and this fall, or in January, they're hiring a permanent farm manager that we will direct and manage, and they will sort of, you know, fund as a kind of creative relationship, in addition to purchasing the product from us. And so all of a sudden, SAP becomes an institutional social enterprise. Through indirection, find direction. I don't even know what an ISE is, but we're doing it. We are being creative with institutional form and systems change, and using our subposition to affect change in the larger position, right? Social enterprises are organizations that apply commercial strategies to maximize improvements in human and environmental well-being rather than maximizing profits for external stakeholders. SAP is functioning like a business of sorts within the university bureaucracy that allow us to experiment with things that the university wants but the university can't do. And so, again, what we market, I discovered, is really three things. A, produce. Like I said, this year, probably 30,000 pounds of produce. But we also market a halo effect to dining services. And what's that? Well, that's the good feeling that consumers have by being connected to something they like. And this halo effect is not trivial, because it translates into greater customer satisfaction and greater revenue, because people like eating good food. We also market them multifunctional embeddedness. And granted, I discovered these terms after we did it, and I had to frame it theoretically. But what I mean by this is that we are helping the dining services become much more deeply embedded, not just in the university, but in the community, as entities that are creating resources within the system that didn't exist before, and creating relationships to the community that empower them in ways that would make any bean counter think twice before they're privatized. And that is not, again, a trivial matter, right? Because they all want to remain self-operated, and there's so many good reasons why they should. But that's not necessarily shared by everyone. So we are engaging creative change within an institution organized around equilibrium. And we are trying to operationalize something called an institutional multiplier effect, in which resources for crossing silos has been created by this partnership between academics and operations. And so, you know, we, beginning in 2014, will channel $120,000 that go toward academic benefit, creating a laboratory to teach all of these complicated things about social ecological systems, working with natural systems to get what you need without compromising them, and working with complicated, stubborn institutions that may want to change but have so many reasons why they can't. So, what we're trying to do is an action research project that is geared towards harmonizing problems and solutions within an engaged framework. We want students knowing the struggles with the bureaucracy. We want students understanding how to, you know, operationalize an organic rotation system. We want students to know how to interact with a grocer, right? So that they bring these flexible skill sets to wherever they go so that they can change other institutions. We're harmonizing our greatest problem, the depletion of natural systems, with our greatest product, our students. We're mobilizing the principle of subsidiarity by taking responsibility for our own household. We're modeling distributive systems for critical infrastructure. I could talk about water systems and energy systems where we're doing similar things on the farm, but we don't have time. And we're modeling steps towards sustainable social ecological systems. Thank you.